We talk about sustainable development. But is it possible for our economies to grow at the same time as protecting our environment for the future?
To me, the heart of sustainable development is about, can we build a thriving, resilient, vibrant society?
We have targets that we have to meet in terms of our housing needs. We have to put the housing somewhere.
It's important that we play our full part in creating sustainable environments. We believe that our work needs to be responsible, but it also needs to be profitable.
I think it's when we reconnect people with nature on their doorstep that we start to have an opportunity to think about what sustainable development might be in our lives.
The public is starting to wake up to the fact that our climate is changing, but in terms of how we conduct our day-to-day business, I don't think they really understand that implication.
In Scotland, both the government and local councils are making it their business to start learning how to operate in a more sustainable way. They recognise that to seriously tackle the issue of climate change, people will need to be encouraged to embrace a wide range of new ways of doing things and to make sustainability integral to their lives. Currently, the good intentions are often there, but the behaviour change isn't. But this needn't be the case.
There's a real challenge for many people in city authorities, local authorities, businesses, in the sense that sustainability often ends up being something that is a compliance function. It's something that is a tick box at the bottom of a form that you have to have done. And yet we're actually moving into a world when, with particularly around energy and local energy production, particularly thinking through the needs for delivering infrastructure that meets or can deal with changing climate. We're having to rethink sustainability. And actually, if we put sustainability at the heart of infrastructure development, economic development, social change within society, and stop using it as a tick box at the bottom, then actually we can start to deliver much more effective communities, cities that people actually want to live in.
Could our growing ability to gather and analyse data be at the heart of enabling us to live more sustainably?
We were set up largely to try and help bring people together to solve challenges around climate change, sustainable development. And our focus is on how do you put good ideas into practice. And data analytics is increasingly important in terms of providing the information that allows us to deliver the outcomes we want.
Data underpins everything that we do. More and more as time passes, data becomes more relevant to our decision-making processes. Our understanding of data has improved over the years, and our understanding of how to collate data in the same way over different fields, different sectors. The real key is about how we cross-analyse these different things. The problem that we've had in the past is you tend to look at data sets you know. So when you're asked a specific question, if it's energy, for example, we go and look at the consumption data or the carbon emissions data, but we might not have looked at event data in the city, which may have been responsible for an increased amount of people coming into the city, therefore an increased amount of service use, therefore an increased amount of energy use. And we, without seeing all those different kind of analytics, may mistakenly analyse that as an unnecessary increase in consumption. We've become much more efficient at managing our data and then being able to extract more value out of that. Now we're building systems that can do a lot of that analysis automatically for us. So we're trying to automate the processes as much as possible to allow us then to be spending our time making decisions based on that analysis. So the Smart Street project is built on data.
Glasgow is one of 6 European cities taking part in the ruggedised Smart City project, exploring how to develop sustainable, resilient and low-carbon cities. As part of its research, Glasgow is creating a sustainable energy district, a smart street, which will produce and deliver energy locally using wind turbines, power storage and an innovative solar canopy.
So,
This is the top of the Duke Street car park. This is the car park that forms basically the central hub of the smart street that we're developing in Glasgow. We are going to be creating a solar canopy on the roof of this car park covering each of these car park spaces. At the very peak of its ability, it will generate 200 kilowatts of renewable electricity, which we will then use to either power the car park, power electric vehicle charging points, or store energy within the 500 kilowatt battery that we're also going to install on the ground floor. One of the other things that we're doing is working with our partners in the project, the Wheatley Group, who are a social housing group that own this high-rise block and the housing that you can see in this area here called the Drygate. What we're going to do here is install a battery, a 92 kilowatt battery in the basement of this high-rise block, which is going to store electricity to provide heat to these residents. What we are looking to do here is to store electricity when it's at its cheapest, or to store electricity that we have generated here for them to consume at later times when it's at its most expensive. That way we can provide some alleviation from fuel poverty and make sure that the benefits that are felt from this installation here are realised locally.
If sustainable development is going to be achieved, it looks like it will rely on a joined-up world where government, local authorities, energy suppliers and consumers all work together for the best outcome.
Increasingly, we are taking more time about trying to find out, as we are transitioning into a renewable energy economy, that we actually need to speak to a wider range of stakeholders. To give you one example, electric vehicles now means that we need to have very active discussions with local authorities in terms of how we plan our cities and towns and rural areas, how we talk to our transport operators in terms of what our cars and buses and lorries will look like in the future, and how we will talk with a range of other public and private bodies in terms of how we move into potentially using electricity as a main source of heating for our homes and for our offices.
So for sustainable development, we're moving into a world where there is very rapid technology change. All these new technologies like electric vehicles, solar panels, small wind, batteries. We're now in a world where you can have peer-to-peer energy trading autonomously, driven by little robots which actually just trade and share electricity between households. And a huge challenge that we have with anything to do with things like smart cities is that this tends to be seen to be a big corporation or a big local council, city council, doing things to people. Whereas actually at the heart of sustainable development will be, how do you actually sit down, engage with local communities and ask what they need, and then support them to deliver their needs, and using technology to do that. But as long as there is a strong relationship between what they are trying to achieve as a community and what the outcome is, then we see them accepting technology very happily.
Scotland has committed to delivering 50% of all of its energy from renewables by 2030. As well as ambitious smart city projects that aim to alter the way we make and use energy, there are numerous smaller scale projects that may play their part in influencing human behaviour. Projects which are also dependent on gathering data.
Essentially, the City Sounds project is about understanding the interaction between humans and biodiversity in the city. So what we really wanted to do with this project was to not only test a new approach to collecting data in the city, but we also really wanted to engage people in the community with biodiversity in public parks and green spaces.
How we're doing that is using special microphones to be able to listen in to that activity, basically placed in some special wooden boxes which we mount in the trees. And they are an example of an Internet of Things device. These microphones are transmitting audio to a back-end server within the university. We have some sophisticated analytics which allow us to scramble people's voices. It's a very broad spectrum microphone, so we go right up into the ultrasonic part of the audio spectrum. And that allows us, for example, to hear bats as they're out hunting insects, for example. And bats are a great indicator of healthy biodiversity.
So we want people to begin to understand a little bit more about how they interact with and influence on biodiversity. So for example, you might look around the meadows and think that this is a place for doing sports and having physical activities and festivals and things like that, but it's actually a hugely important place for biodiversity, which we know is essential to ecosystems and their thriving and health in the city. And so we want people to be able to think about that aspect that's not entirely visible, but maybe through sound it will become a bit more tangible to them.
In the future, what we'll be able to do is to train machine learning models to recognize the characteristic signatures of particular types of activity. So this will drive the development of what we call embedded intelligence, and then hopefully what we'll be able to do is bring that evidence to people who are making policy about investments in green space.
How can a small-scale project that involves recording wildlife in an Edinburgh park really impact on sustainable development? Those involved believe that increasing public interest and understanding of biodiversity is at the heart of promoting change.
My part of the project has been to look at ways to excite and engage the community in the kinds of things that we've been doing, and make a sound installation. If communities are excited about the potential of biodiversity or concerned about the lack of it or the loss of it, it's the people who will be voting to encourage governments to change direction. So an engaged community might be empowered to steer us towards a more sustainable future.
Projects like City Sounds add to a growing body of research that underlines the importance of green spaces within cities. Vital when almost 70% of the world's population is projected to live in urban areas by 2050.
The Scottish Government energy strategy sets a target of by 2030 making sure that 50% of all energy is low carbon and renewables. So we've been looking at ground source heat systems in parks, and this has been possible because we now have 2 new data sets, one of which from Ordnance Survey maps and categorises every green space across urban Britain. And in Scotland we've also got heat mapping from Scottish Government that maps and identifies where there's a demand for heat. When we bring those 2 data sets together, where we get that overlay, that's where we start to see where there is demand, where there are customers for energy, and where there are parks that could potentially be suppliers of energy. We're standing here in Possil Park in Glasgow. I mean, typical of many urban areas. I mean, you can see signs of the previous sort of physical improvements that have happened here. We've got the planters and the bollards. But what's kind of happened is the capital investment has come in, but there hasn't really been any money then to maintain it and to support the investment. And that's really very negative to communities, because what sort of message does this send to you about how the place is looking at the moment and the sort of power or the powerlessness of the people who live near here? And so when communities get involved in consultation events, they want to make sure that what happens next time is here for good, it's permanent. And that really is that link to sustainability and sustainable development.
Changes in the design and management of public parks, green spaces and areas of wasteland is at the heart of Green Space Scotland's mission. They believe a new approach can contribute to climate change adaptation and mitigation.
In Scotland, we really love our parks, but what we're starting to think about now is new ways of generating income from and for our parks. Because what we've got, if you look over here, is a wasted space. It's been cleared, but if it's not used for development, how about using this for the ground source heat system? We've got a nearby health centre, and this could then start to generate energy for the new health centre. It could become a new community green space quite close to the main street and to all of the facilities.
There's growing recognition that climate change is going to require all of us to adapt the way we operate. Climate Ready Clyde is a partnership of local councils, transport bodies, universities, environmental regulators and the Health Board. Its aim is to build resilience to climate change by creating an integrated strategy for the region.
We're supported by the Scottish Government, and the first thing that we're doing is getting a systematic understanding of the evidence of risk of climate change. So Climate Ready Clyde's a partnership of 13 different organisations. All those different organisations understand that climate change poses a risk, but we don't have a collective view about what are the things that we need to tackle first and how do we make change. So we're developing an adaptation strategy and action plan to move the city region to being more resilient in the face of a future climate. Businesses need to understand that if we don't adapt to a changing climate alongside the urgent emissions reductions that we need, then it potentially goes to the core of their business. You know, it affects things like the ability to supply customers, it could result in cost increases. So the really smart businesses already understand that and are actually starting to think about climate proofing their business, either because their investors demand it, their shareholders demand it, but also because it makes good business sense.
Sustainable development is often very political, but increasingly, because of the opportunities for what we would think of as just co-benefits, so if you deliver a clean transport system, actually you reduce air pollution, which actually reduces the cost on the NHS. If you improve the quality of homes, you get less fuel poverty. You then have less long-term expenditure on social care, for example. So you start to see how by improving the quality of the environment within which people are living, you can reduce the overall cost to society. And many local authorities that we are working with recognise this. And so many of the developments that we are working with local councils on, which might be new city extension projects or new towns being built, they are absolutely trying to embed some of these ideas right at the start.
Maidenhill, a site south of Glasgow, where over 1,000 homes are being built, is an example of a new development that set out to take a more sustainable approach. The decision to choose a greenbelt site was controversial.
We had great resistance to development within this area. It was another greenbelt development, so there were a lot of objections to it. Within East Renfrewshire, we don't have as much opportunity to develop brownfield sites. We have very little vacant land, so we are directed mostly towards the greenbelt. So it's very important for us to try to do this in as sustainable a way as we can. And the opportunity to master plan and to look at the whole site holistically was very important to us.
We set up a collaborative working group with the 5 landowners, developers here, and we worked in partnership with them. From the outset of the planning process and at every step of the way, we were absolutely determined to deliver a special place that had sustainability at the heart of it. And we did that in a number of ways. We knew there were issues over flooding, drainage. So our very first engagement was with the Green Network Partnership, and they guided us through the process of hydrology, water management, where the water went in the site. We talked to them about how we embedded an integrated green infrastructure right from the basis of the master plan and through every stage of the process. But we also appreciated that the commercial aspect of their development is ultimately developers are here to build homes but also to make a profit. So, you know, we accepted that there would be standard house types, but in a setting that enhanced the entire development.
For the new developments, increasingly we are seeing organisations being asked in to say, how do we build it in from the start? How do we build in smart, connected local energy systems? How do we build in electric vehicles and active travel and green space into that community? And that's at the heart of understanding that the long-term costs, social costs and economic costs to the society actually will be lower if you build in sustainability from the start.
When we started the process, we started with what was known as a development framework, which set very broad, high principles. This site is 1,000 new homes. That brings with it children who require to be educated, and that was made clear to the developers at an early stage that 2 schools had to be provided to make this development happen. So there is significant development contributions which will go towards enhancing library and social facilities. There's a big contribution which will go to Damsted Darnley Country Park, which will allow all of the residents in East Renfrewshire to benefit from the enhancements there.
It's a large-scale development and its implementation will be over a period of years, so it was very important for us to make sure that we future-proofed the site, that we introduced opportunities for instance, the charging points for electric cars, that we gave people the opportunity to work close to home. Agile working is a big thing across the country. So it's very much about reducing the need for people to travel if they don't need to. We'll look at the wider aspects of climate change across the authority and adaptation and mitigation of those form a key part of our local development plan.
There was a lot of local concern about the potential impact of the development on local watercourses and the risk of flooding, which led to some changes in what was permitted. But it hasn't satisfied everyone locally.
Maidenhill is a very large development, and we fully appreciate that the local council and the developers have put in a lot of effort to develop a master plan. The public were consulted on that master plan, but unfortunately from our perspective it doesn't meet the expectations that we had, and it's the interpretation of the master plan and the fine detail of that master plan that we're concerned about. New development will always bring issues with drainage. More properties, increased sewage. Properties with areas of increased hard standing means more runoff, so it's the way you manage that runoff water. We've also got external factors coming into play. We've got climate change, which is increasing the expectations of rainfall, and also the weather patterns are changing, so we're having harder, shorter rainstorms, which cause additional flooding. What hasn't been looked at in sufficient detail is the impact of the additional water volume on the existing watercourses, and in particular the culverts where the old watercourses have been put in pipes.
We feel that we have taken every aspect of flooding and drainage into account. We were well aware of the issues. It actually ended up at a judicial review, which found in the council's favour. We have tried a lot to make sure to allay people's fears that this site will not exacerbate downstream flooding. They wouldn't have got permission for it if it didn't meet all of the environmental requirements.
Historically, flooding has been a serious problem in the area, which has led to the establishment of the White Cart Water Flood Defences, an ambitious scheme aimed at protecting thousands of homes and businesses. It's been planned with future climate change in mind. So far, 3 floodwater storage sites have been constructed, creating 9 hectares of permanent wetlands.
The use of what we call upper catchment storage areas, which are these dammed off areas with the hydro breaks that control the water level, allows us to hold back water in the time of a storm. That water, if it weren't held here, would be cascading through the river downstream in the built-up areas in the southwest of Glasgow and would be causing significant flood risk. By holding that water back here, we reduce the impact of the water running through the river downstream until the storm has passed and the water can be released. This particular flood prevention scheme has an element of sustainability built into it. When we viewed the options available to us in terms of locating upper catchment storage areas, we were able to pick 3 out of a list of 9 candidates. Should we require to, we can go and revisit some of those other locations and bring them on stream as additional upper catchment storage areas to take account of climate change in the future. We've had several advantages, I suppose, built into constructing an upper catchment storage area. We've been able to introduce areas of wetland. Indeed, we've actually managed to introduce some 90,000 square metres of wetland habitat that bring in species of bird and other animal that frankly would never have come here had they not been there.
The Scottish Government's also working hard to create a more sustainable transport network, encouraging more cycling and walking and phasing out conventional fossil fuel cars by 2032. It's also introduced an electric vehicle loan scheme.
I do think the Scottish Government has done a lot to encourage responsible driving, as well as getting people to give up petrol and diesel cars and change their way of looking at the world. They've done this through giving grants for getting charge points in, so you can have an electric car and charge at home if you've got a driveway, to making sure that there's a very large Scotland-wide network of public charge points. So even if you cannot put a charge point anywhere near your home, there'll be a public one somewhere within 5 or 10 miles that you could use, and so you wouldn't be excluded from joining the electric revolution.
In terms of transport, one of the things that we're doing is working with a regional transport partnership on the development of the new regional transport strategy. Now, obviously they have very bold visions around low carbon transport and modal shift to help us meet our mitigation targets, but we're also talking to them about how we can build in adaptation into that process, because we want to see more people on sustainable transport modes. We're encouraging that because it's about being more resilient. It's easier to manage a transport network that's disrupted if you have control over the transport methods, like the trains, like the buses. It's much easier to direct those in terms of during flood events or during storm events than it is to control the individual behaviours of everybody that works and lives in the city region.
So data is increasingly important, but at the heart of sustainable development is not the data, it is the people. We need to keep in mind when we're talking about a lot of the changes we are seeking with sustainable development around smart cities, sustainable communities, is actually making sure we're focusing on the needs of the people and using the technology, using the data to deliver the information which allows us to do things that we want to do to deliver those outcomes.
Historically, in my experience, there's nothing more likely to stop a technology from delivering what it's supposed to than human beings. And behavioural change is an absolute critical aspect of any kind of intervention. It's all well and good having renewable energy being generated and stored, but it's not of much value if it's been consumed in a profligate manner. So we need to work with our citizens so that they understand where that energy is coming from, how best to utilise that energy, and we're doing that through various different citizen engagement activities that we're having, working with our citizens within the smart street to try and inform them what's happening and how best that they might extract value out of that through learning new ways to behave.
We believe it is important that we engage with a wider community around the issues of climate change so that people understand why we need to make that change from fossil fuels into renewable sources of energy, and learn more about why it is so important that we make these really major changes in our society.
In terms of involving the public in the decisions that we make around how do we adapt as a society, it's a really important issue and something that we need to make sure that we do more. The public is starting to wake up to the fact that our climate is changing, but in terms of what that means as a society and an economy and how we conduct our day-to-day business, I don't think they really understand that implication. There's also a particular issue around the most vulnerable communities and making sure that they have a voice in the process.
I think we are already developing technologies, behaviours, systems, services for our future generations that mean that they will live a much more sustainable life. The challenge is the adults that exist right now, those of us that have lived with energy in abundance, with the expectation that as soon as I hit a switch, I get what I want. It's the challenge to change that behaviour, and ultimately, as human beings, that's where we struggle the most. So sustainable development is our ability to meet the needs of the present by changing our behaviours and accepting that the ways of the past are maybe not the ways of the future.